Well, hello, everyone. This is Brad Boyson talking to you from Dubai, and this is HCM Impact. This is a weekly discussion with some of the movers and shakers in the human capital reporting space. And we're talking specifically about the ISO 30414 standard. My guest today is joining us from California, Jeff Higgins. Hello, Jeff.
Hi, Brad. Great to be here.
Yeah, loving your background there. Is that the morning and we're at the night here in Dubai? Is that what's happening?
Well, it is morning here, but it's an evening photo.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, thank you for joining us. And this is, I think, our fifth session that we've put together. And I know the topic that we prearranged to discuss was because of your contribution, some of the other metrics that are in some of the other ISO standards. And I'm really looking forward to this. And, I'm not saying it because it's on a piece of paper. I want to capture some of your wisdom because I think, like a lot of people, we've really put a lot of effort into certain standards in the ISO family. And I think based on your background and the IT aspect that you've been working on, you've probably had more opportunity to look at sort of some of the broader spillover. And I think that'll be a great benefit for a lot of the audience. But maybe the best place to start, as we're at the beginning, is just a brief introduction about yourself and how you became involved in ISO standards for HR.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I grew up in first career in finance and accounting, ultimately as a controller, a VP of finance for a company, and a CFO. So I have always been involved in the numbers. And when I worked with HR, it was usually to get money out of them from a budget standpoint, or to approve their bonuses. The joke I tell now is I'm paying for my sins of the past, having crossed over and worked in HR for a number of years as a practitioner in analytics. So ultimately, as a CFO, I worked closely with HR, and HR was not known for their numbers expertise. In fact, why people don't go into human resources historically for the numbers, although today it's a very hot area, as we know. So fast forward to the early 2000s, I had an opportunity to go to work for a publicly traded bank. And once in HR to run their compensation function and a few other areas of HR, and they said, "Oh, numbers person in HR." So the projects, the questions, the metrics started coming, and discovered my true passion in life. So I'd always liked finance and accounting, but it never really stoked the passion. So putting numbers to the workforce, the detective aspect of it from a predictive analytics standpoint, and just trying to quantify people better was really an eye opener for me. So I have been pursuing that since 2001. So now 20 years on that, both as a practitioner and then as a consultant, starting a company called HCMI. And soon after starting HCMI, ISO formed TC 260, and I got involved not at the very beginning, but almost the beginning in about 2011. Hey, there's a group that's trying to put together metrics for HR and how to measure it, which was my passion. So it was sort of how could I not be involved in that question?
Yeah, I think we're hearing a very similar theme from some of the people we're talking to. There's human capital numbers, people, Venn diagram overlap. And I understand too that correct me if I'm wrong, that you're the one responsible for the branding Raise the Tide. Is that correct?
Oh, well, if they wish to give me credit, we were all banding around, names, but one of the things was really, who benefits from all this? And really it's like raising the tide. Everyone benefits from HR standards. I mean, again, you can think of my accounting and finance background. When I crossed HR, I said, okay, where's the standard book for how we measure and report HR? And they said, oh, you mean the employee handbook? I'm like, no, I don't want to know how many leaves of absence I get, or how many days I get of this, or what the policy is on sick days. I want to know, how do we measure and report things and metrics in HR? We don't have anything like that. So you don't have any generally accepted principles for HR measurement and reporting? No. And so that's the genesis for the ISO TC 260. That's the genesis for the standards. And really, the group Raise the Tide and Human Capital Impact is all about raising awareness of standards, particularly ISO 30414, Human Capital Reporting Guidelines, which I would argue is a huge foundational building block, like a cornerstone for what I'd call gap reporting for HR, how to measure
Sure.
and report
Yeah.
HR.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote a paper and I think it was published as a chapter in a book many years ago where I used that same acronym, is generally accepted HR principles. And because of the, the legacy in North America with GAAP as it relates to finance and accounting and IFRS and Europe and the rest of the world. And it is one of those things that I'm seeing. One of the patterns is people who have touched or have some background in finance, accounting, numbers, metrics, whatever you want to call it. They understand the value add of this project, this aspirational goal that many of us have, and it's a big challenge to explain it to some of the other stakeholders involved. And so I know we do want to talk about some of the other metrics in some of the other standards, but just for a while, maybe focusing on 30414, you mentioned this. What is so special about that standard?
Well, what's special about it? And you're right, there are some other good standards out there, but I again, I would still come back to it's probably the best. Well, one, it's comprehensive, so it has
Mm-hmm,
metrics, and that's what it was designed for.
mm-hmm.
And it was really includes a lot of elements about the why and the how, as well as the what. It's not just a collection of a list of metrics, although it has a lot of them in there, and formulas for the vast majority, the rest of which we're working on with technical specifications to flesh out. But really, it gives more of a story about what is this and why does it matter and who benefits and what are the difference. Even defines the various stakeholder groups, and that comprehensiveness and context that it gives is really valuable and important. Not to mention the fact that it has metrics from every area of what you call talent management lifecycle, as well as things that are more traditional, like health and safety, as well as things that are hot now in various parts of the world around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, it's I'm making notes as you're talking here, and one of the things that I was thinking about was just, I think people who've spent a lot of time in one industry or one type of role as HR often make a lot of assumptions that we're all practicing the same HR, that we're using the same definitions. And I'll share one of my stories. Is many years ago, and some people, this doesn't resonate too well with, but I was working for an organization where they defined a department as a larger entity than a division. In other words, a division reported to a department.
Okay.
And that was the first time I'd ever seen that. And I was like, whoa. And I remember having an ISO auditor come in and an external auditor come in and do an 9001 audit. And one of the first things I pulled up was my list of, here's the things that we as an organization and culture don't use that are typical to the market. And again, that reinforces to me the value of the ambitions that we're trying to distill. And
Yep.
how about in terms of, the challenge in terms of the mindset that how can you have metrics that are positioned as sort of being universal? Isn't work, industries, government, for profit so different that it requires a completely different kind of reporting? How would you address that question?
Right. Of course. I'm complete agreement. That's why in accounting, IFRS and GAAP is completely different and unique for every industry. Oh, no, wait a minute. It's not. It's the same. So what I would push back is these people are saying, well, yes, every company is unique. Every person is unique. Every industry has some unique aspects to it. However, there are common measurements and metrics which are applicable to all. Some would be very critical in one industry and not so important or critical in another. So I'll give you a couple of really quick examples. I mean, think about it. In accounting and finance, we all start with revenue and you end with bottom line profit. Unless you get into nonprofit, which, by the way, they have a surplus, which is just basically another definition for profit or remainder. So they are the same. You can have a few differences and nuances, but you need the common metrics and guidelines and standards. And then what I would argue, yes, you can go off into some different depths based on industry. So my example I was going to give, so turnover. So turnover rate, cost of turnover. In the utilities business, people join and they never leave. They retire out. So they have very low attrition, really not a problem. That would not be a critical metric for them, would not be a big cost in terms of cost of turnover. It might be a risk in terms of retirement if they get a massive retirements. But then you go to retail. Well, they're happy if they can get people to stay, pre-pandemic anyway. If they can get people to stay for a year, that's a good hire. That's a good employee. So they have an attrition rate which can be over 100% a year. Whole different ballgame. So huge cost, huge churn, very critical metric for that industry. So yeah, the criticality of the metrics changes, but the fact that it's relevant and important never does.
Yeah, and again, one of the benefits I'm getting out of these discussions is, as you're talking, I'm also thinking, from my own frame of reference. And, when you have these standards and they're comparable, apples to apples, oranges to oranges. I had one of my students many years ago call me, gone through one of the courses for professional qualification, and I'm the instructor, I'm sort of the mentor. And then she called me with a real world work question, maybe 3-4 months later. And she said, Brad, our CEO wants to know if our turnover is good or bad. And I don't know how to answer the question. You tell me, you're the, the guru that upskilled me to where I'm at now. And I said, actually, I can't answer that question. We as HR don't have a way of sort of formally answering that question. So this is where the informal network, you kind of have to talk to your colleagues, other people who work in similar, and she was shocked, and rightly so. And I was actually kind of shocked with my own answer because it was so unprofessional, right? It was, you go through this course, you get this qualification, and then in the end, you just got to talk to your friends and find out what's really going on. And like you, I started in finance. That is my first degree is in finance. And I think when people sort of have that foundation of definitions and recipes and formulas and whatever word you want to use, common, generally accepted principles, it's extremely helpful to be more effective.
Right. I mean, this enables, speaking of stakeholders, investors to measure apples to apples across companies within an industry, and even, to a lesser extent across industries. But not having a standard, everyone can kind of come up with their own metric. Everyone can define it the way they want, which, by the way, organizations do. One of the jokes I would tell is, okay, is if someone passes away, they go home, they're working for the company for a long time, they pass away in the night, obviously they're not coming to work the next day. Is that voluntary or involuntary turnover?
Yeah,
I've heard that before. Classrooms, they all differ, and most of them would say, well, it's voluntary. Well, why do you say voluntary? Well, because the definition of involuntary means the company's the one doing it, right? Meaning you're letting them go, and obviously the company didn't kill them.
Right.
Well, we work them hard, but not that hard. Well, but it's not, did they voluntary means they chose it. Well, it doesn't fit either definition. And so it's funny when you get into things like simple metrics like turnover, everyone agrees at the top level. As you start getting into layers, there's no agreement. And so everyone measures and reports things different. We include that. We don't include that. And without these global standards, you just don't have that. I would argue the standard itself, both 30414 and other TC 260 ISO standards, are taking organizations out of the darkness and into the light. So, as well as raising the tide. Basically, let's give everybody a set of metrics they can all use globally. Investors, stakeholders, governments can all see how you're doing. From an ESG and transparency standpoint, you should report and disclose more of these metrics so you can show that one of your most important stakeholder group, in fact, perhaps your most important stakeholder group, your employees and workforce, here's how you do in terms of managing, building that sustainable asset. And truly, they are the source of your sustainability.
In hindsight, I never thought this would have come from the investor community for all kinds of errant biases. One of them is, this idea that HR has always been moving away from the shareholder, and we want to talk about stakeholders. So we've got this human approach of trying to move away, and yet here come the investment community saying what you do is important, but we need something from you. We need to have more standardization in the way you communicate your success. And one of the key talking points that a lot of people will reference, and we've referenced it before, and I've heard you reference it before too, is this migration from where is the value creation in organizations, from the tangible assets to the intangible, of which human capital is obviously a huge and sometimes the holistic aspect of that. Again, we talk a lot about 30414, and I want to pull your expertise on some of the other metrics, some of the other standards. Enlighten us. What are some of the other value adds in reporting that are coming out from the other standards that you're aware of?
Well, I'll give you the bad news first, and then the good news. So the bad news is a lot of the other good metrics that are coming out aren't out yet.
Right.
So there's a lot of technical specifications that are adding to fleshing out the metrics that were created, and the topic areas around, like turnover and recruiting and training and mobility. So all of these areas need more fleshing out. The metrics that are in approximately 59, 60 metrics that are in the ISO standard for 30414 are definitely not enough. Does that mean companies need to report hundreds of metrics? No, probably not. But you need to have a couple or a few in every area. And so the technical specifications can add a lot to that. But there are a couple of really good ones that I can talk about that are referenced. And by the way, the whole goal is to reference, cross-reference in standards, the various metrics and the work that's been done. So one that was done early on, as early as 2012, was cost per hire. And it was actually quantified at both an internal and an external basis: internal cost per hire, external cost per hire. And it was really exhaustive in terms of the elements to include. Which is a good way to do it, because that way, if a company doesn't have one of the cost elements, they can always just exclude it if they don't have it or they don't use it. But better to include too much than too little. Another one that's really good is quality of hire, and that one is also referenced. By the way, both of these are referenced in the ISO 30414 standard. But that's actually, you think about cost per hire and time to fill, the two most measured things in recruiting, and yet those are very operational and efficiency. They have nothing to do with effectiveness, meaning, wow, we were really fast and we got that opening filled really quick, but did you get a good hire, or did you just get a butt in a seat? Butts in seats quick is what you get when you focus on cost per hire and time to fill. Well, if what organizations and leaders really want, they just don't know what else they should be measuring. Perfect example for why they need other metric is quality of hire. Did we get a good fit? Are they going to stay longer? Are they going to perform better? Are they going to grow within the organization? Is there a metric that we can use, or an index of metrics that we can combine to measure that? And in fact, it is what I would call an index metric, meaning it has several different things that make up the quality of hire itself.
I remember the cost per hire standard when it came out early on too. And it was interesting because it received a lot of criticism from different stakeholders of its, wow, we're going to develop standards. Each standard's going to be, a core metric with 3 or 4 subsets. And what I've come, and I want to get your input. We are by sample because, we're pretty much aligned on this, but, I think it separates people who've actually worked in HR from people who have just studied HR. Because if you think that you can just assume that everything is working well, that are the basics or the fundamentals, and then you can get into these sort of higher level, more esoteric theories, competencies, abstractions. When you're working in HR, if something isn't working, that becomes your priority. I don't care how well intended you
Wherever
are.
the fire's burning.
The fires get put out. And so people in, and I'll use the expression sometimes in ivory towers, who are saying, all things being equal, assuming all the fundamentals are working, this is the things you should be doing to add value. And I've just never bought into it, and I'm actually becoming more frustrated with that mindset, because at least to me it's a bit of misrepresentation. It's like building a car, and you have a car, and then you maybe try to put an engine in it for a Ferrari or an F1 or something like that, or an Indy car, and then you wonder why the car doesn't work on the road. You say, but you've got this, hundreds of thousands of dollars of engine machinery. Yeah, but the body's not designed to go at that speed, and the wheels weren't meant for these roads, and so it's just, I think one of the things I admire about the people who are developing these standards and advocating for them is the holistic understanding of where the value comes from. Do better. It's like you said earlier on the metrics. If you want to do better and have more sophisticated metrics, go to it. But if you don't have common denominators at the foundation, this is just measuring for the sake of measuring. This is training for the sake of training. This is, the worst case scenarios of HR. And maybe just your thoughts on those comments, if any.
Sure. There's really a lot we could discuss there. And what I would argue is metrics and standards force you to be a little more comprehensive, as opposed to, let's just go over here and work on this. Let's just go over here and work on this, which when I was in HR as a practitioner is what happened. You go, whatever the fire is, it's often all hands on deck, or almost all hands on deck in HR on whatever the urgent priority of the day, the week, the month, or the year is. And there are many of them. I would argue HR is the one area where they really don't control their schedules or their priorities much at all. Other areas, do have challenges, surprises that pop up. But HR, you come in every day, and I'll just, a nameless manager in one of your departments or divisions or functions has set a fire, meaning they did something really bad and now there's a big issue, or they didn't do something that needed to be done and now there's a big issue. Or there's, some big new challenge that the organization is facing that's going to require a lot of effort from HR to manage it through the workforce. So all of that takes away a lot of time. In fact, when I was a practitioner doing analytics, my biggest complaint was I don't get to spend enough time doing analytics. I'm always on these other projects.
Yeah.
So having standards forces companies, at least however many times a year they're going to report it, to pause, measure, report. And actually just doing the measurement is really the beginning. That's not what it's intended to do. It's what does it mean? Because CEOs, boards of directors, and other stakeholder groups, they're not so much interested in the metric. They're interested in the story behind the metric. And I would argue HR's biggest challenge is not measuring the HR metrics that are in the standard, or coming up with their own slight variation that they think works better for them. It's telling the story around what those metrics mean to the investor. So it doesn't matter if your turnover is, just like your question, turnover rate is 21%. Well, is that good or bad? Well, tell me what company, what industry, and I'll tell you, boy, if that's a retail, that's fantastic. Your Starbucks are better. Or on the other hand, if you're, an energy and utility company, say, wow, you guys are really doing something wrong, because your peers are all at, 2, 3, 5% a year, and half of that is retirements. So it's all contextual, and it's to your point. Did you improve it? Are you improving it? By the way, any metric, they say, what's a good score? Well, of course you can benchmark it, but continuous improvement is a fantastic way to focus the organization and bring the organization, particularly HR, who's historically been numbers challenged. They made enormous progress. Many universities are training and teaching on HR and people analytics across the world now. So it's becoming more normal, but it's just a tremendous opportunity to balance HR and give it the level, I would argue, of strategic impact and professionalism that all other areas in large organizations have.
Yeah. And I listened to your narrative and I'm thinking, okay, I remember that time in my second HR job where I improved a benefit plan and found sort of a flaw in it and saved the organization $300,000. That's pretty strategic to me, in terms of the value add that has. And you talk about cost per hire. In my first employer here in Dubai, I used that metric to make the case that the internal recruiting team that I was supervising was more effective in a qualitative and quantitative way. And I quantified it to the CEO and the CFO to demonstrate the comparison between using an external headhunter or other
Yep.
agencies.
Yep.
And intrinsically, I think a lot of HR people know this. They go, oh, the agencies are
Yep.
very expensive and they don't necessarily have our organization's best interest in mind. Sometimes
Yep.
we don't get the
Yep.
best candidates. Well, you've got this alignment with your own organization as an internal HR practitioner. Using these metrics empower you in a strategic way, even if the metric itself may be more operational. And again, I think the ivory tower crowd sometimes don't get that.
Oh, I completely agree. In fact, I would go so far as to say HR has an opportunity to significantly impact organizational performance and bottom line, far
Yeah,
more than accounting and finance, with the
yeah,
possible
yeah,
exception of the
yeah,
tax department.
yeah,
So accounting and finance are
yeah,
mostly scorekeepers. I am
yeah,
picking on myself in my prior life. I was scorekeeping.
yeah.
Uh, I was budgeting. I was helping with the discipline of trying to stay on budgets and targets and forecasts. HR, yeah, by hiring better quality people, you're going to get more output. Your cost per hire would be less. You'd have fewer open positions, higher levels of employee engagement, better retention, better branding. Ultimately, you're able to continue to attract better staff. It becomes a cycle of virtual, benefit and gain when you're really doing a lot of things right. And there are some really leading organizations that do not all, but many of those aspects really well, and it gives them a competitive advantage.
Couldn't agree with you more. You have a unique background in this project related to the IT side. So I want to ask you fairly directly, how do, we often talk about stakeholders, the HR, the investors. What about the IT community in the broad sense? How do they stand to benefit from standards in human resources?
Well, yeah. Well, let me go a couple of directions with that.
Yeah.
One, yeah, I actually have, you know, software, and I actually have some software. So on my pitch here, um, software can't do. In fact, their IT and HR are often going at it all the time because
Yeah.
HR is saying, IT, look, we need better reporting, we need analytics for our business. Our COO, our CEO, our CFO are all honest. We need to turn all this data into a strategic asset for insight, not just data. Our payroll, employee engagement, our core HR data, our learning data, our talent application data, our applicant tracking data, all of it. We need to integrate it and make it better. And IT says, great, we can do that for you. Tell us what you want to measure and report. And HR is like, well, we thought you knew that. No, we need a blueprint or a specification from you. Then we will build it. And of course, HR doesn't have that. They really can't do that other than on a very ad hoc, one-off basis. And ultimately, it gets back to IT and sometimes HR both blaming whoever the software provider is for reporting. So,
Right.
well, the software can't do it. We can't make the software do it. Well, guess what? The big software providers, well, actually big or small, they can't do it if there's no metric standards because they don't know
Right.
how to measure it. So, yeah, it's fair to say the biggest software providers are failing to provide good reporting for HR. That's and analytics, absolutely a true statement. However, without standards, what are they going to help measure? So they just help you download and run a bunch of transactions, and you can build anything you want in Microsoft Excel or your other favorite reporting tool. With ISO standards, they can actually, just like with financial reporting standard,
Right.
international financial reporting standards, GAAP reporting, they have automatic reports that can just come out. And in fact, I would argue, so one of the best aspects of accounting and finance is the balance sheet, the income statement, the cash flow statement,
Sure.
statement of equity. All of that is in essence a standardized set of reports with some standard metrics, and that's what HR needs to truly be on a level playing field. Or ultimately, where I believe, because the value of most businesses today is their people, their human capital, actually a step ahead of finance. No disrespect intended to my prior career and your original career in education. Also, it's not to say it's not value add, but getting the right people and allocating those resources and treating them well and motivating them well and rewarding them well and doing all of the areas of elements of talent management is going to give you a huge competitive advantage. Otherwise, why is it that 10 people in a room with good internet can launch the next unicorn company worth billions of dollars when you have they're sitting side by side or really renting a space? They don't even buy any physical assets. You have all these other companies with billions in physical assets that are worth less than some unicorn company that just wrote some really interesting software.
And it comes back to that intangible capital, of which, what percentage is
Yeah.
human capital, and the success stories speak for themselves. So we're kind of in our final minute here, Jeff, and I want to ask you, sort of in that space of motivating people who may not either understand the rationale for this project, or perhaps, and this is where I'm going with this, what's success in the next few years? What's the vision that you would have that would say to Jeff Higgins, wow, this project has really gone to another level? What would that vision be?
Well, I'll give you the short term and the longer term. The short term
Yep.
is, I think, governments, starting with securities agencies, and actually there's legislation in the U.S. Congress, and the new chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has actually said it's going to be one of his earliest priorities,
Right.
are looking at mandating specific metrics that organizations must report in their financial reporting. They haven't said where. Is it going to be in your annual report, your proxy statement? Can you put it in a separate, ESG or people report? But it's going to be required for disclosure. I think that's going to be the big sea change, because right now organizations are required by the SEC, new law, as you well know, Brad, in the U.S. and actually. In Europe, IFRS
Mm-hmm.
also requires a greater level of disclosure around people metrics. But most organizations, rather than disclosing the metrics, they're just using language, flowery language.
Right.
Oh, we
Right.
care about our people. We're doing all these things, but they
Right.
didn't disclose anything.
Right.
Well, investors are, I'll use their technical term for it, pissed. They've
Yeah.
been they wanted more disclosure, and also they want standard disclosure. So when the SEC said, "Yeah, it's material. Every organization report any metrics is material," and organizations talked about it but didn't give any metrics, they really kind of failed the test of do it yourself. Now I think governments and regulatory agencies are going to mandate it. And then I
Yep.
think fast forward, I actually think my kids or my grandkids are going to be saying, granddad, why is it, how could companies function when they didn't measure and report their people? That seems
Mm-hmm.
crazy, like the dark
Mm-hmm.
ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be at a loss to explain how it was that, securities markets and companies were able to get away without disclosing anything really significant about their people, their talent, their human capital for so many decades. Because I think once we get past that and everyone starts using that data, we're going to look back at this as literally the dark ages of, people measurement. Bad things happen in a dark room, but you turn on the light, transparency solves a lot of problems. I think actually a lot of the issues that the media gets fixated on and the other organizations fear the most are actually going to get much better once disclosure happens and transparency improves. Companies say, oh, we need to report it, therefore we're going to measure it, therefore we're going to work on it and improve it.
Very well said. And an expression that I've come up as a result of these discussions we're having is, I don't think we're necessarily at our gap or our IFRS moment. We're kind of at double entry bookkeeping, where right, where we've all of a sudden
Yeah.
discovered the power of checks and balances, of internal and external sort of reporting, and it's so obvious in hindsight,
Yeah.
but if someone has never taken a course in accounting and they just hear it's just words, double entry bookkeeping. But when you've applied it,
Yeah.
you've reconciled financial reports in the past, you realize that all of these checks and balances are there for your benefit. And I think that's the tipping point we're at right now. Any final thoughts, Jeff?
Oh, completely agree with that. And yeah, we're really just scratching the surface. I mean, remember, accounting and finance accounting essentially is 500 years old. We've
Exactly.
got a bit
Exactly.
of a head start on HR.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we're not going to cover all the ground. And by the way, they still have standard setting bodies that are working hard on various issues every day
Absolutely.
and meeting on a regular
Absolutely.
basis. So I actually think this is a journey, not a destination. But it's really good to have some metrics out there, some standards, and increasing adoption through, kind of raise the tide, as well as human capital impact, a group of experts that are all working in terms of website. You can check out www.humancapitalimpact.com. Check that out, because a lot of experts who are effectively trying to raise the tide and share on a voluntary basis, share information, knowledge, and wisdom about metrics and HR measurement and human capital and predictive analytics and the value that comes from it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's perfect to sort of wrap things up on. Jeff, I want to thank you on behalf of my colleague Fahad and I here in Dubai for spending time with us, and thank you for your contributions to these standards and bringing together human capital management impact as a group and raising the tide. So from Dubai, I want to thank you and say good night.
Thank you, Brad.